Today I'm going to be fitting a stretcher to our stool. I've got a piece of oak. This is actually different to a piece I showed you in a previous episode. It's a little bit wider, so it'll give a little bit more stability to the stool against racking. I'll need to cut some angled shoulders on here and tenons, and I'll need to drive these mortises right the way through. So let's get started. I've clamped up the legs to the seat so that all the angles are right and everything's nice and tight, and I've just squared up lines from the top of the mortises on both sides. Now I want to have a 1/4 inch shoulder on the top of the stretcher, so I'm going to mark 1/4 inch. And I'm going to place my stretcher on top and equalise the amount of material hanging over the ends. Now this is actually a character piece of oak, big knots in it, it's quite wavy as well. Much easier to use something that's plain square all round, but I think this is going to look quite nice. And if we follow these steps carefully, it shouldn't be a problem. Now I've lined up the top of the stretcher to the 2 1/4 inch back marks on the side. Now I'm going to take a sharp pencil and just mark the angle on from the legs. That gives us our 2 shoulder lines. I can then carry those marks right the way round the stretcher, and I can cut my shoulders. I chop the mortises with this 10mm chisel, so I'll want to lay 10mm tenon on the end here. Measuring the thickness of the stretcher, I can see that it's 16mm. Now my mortise is 10mm, so I need to leave 3mm on either side. Now I can knife the shoulder lines, square them across the top and bottom of the stretcher, and join them on the back. Do that both ends, and then I can cut the shoulders, cut the cheeks and cut the tenons to width. Taking the line that I've squared up from the top of the mortise, I can use my bevel gauge to transfer that across to the outside of the stool leg. And square it down the outside. That will give me the top of the mortise on the outside of the leg. I'll take my marking gauge now and set that to the distance to one side of the mortise first and then the other. I can mark that on the outside as well. And all I need to do now is find the length of the mortise, 30mm. Mark that off, and I've got my mortise marked on the outside, and I can cut that through and join with the one on the inside. So already through. Just carefully take that down to each end, remembering that the ends of the mortise are angled. And with most of the waste out, I can clamp that in the vise and pare it clean. There won't be any shoulders on the outside of the seat. The tenon will just come straight through, so we want to try and keep that side of the mortise as clean as possible. On the inside of the legs, these shoulders will cover up any slight discrepancies. With it still in the vise, I'll just clean up that shoulder with a chisel. Now that I've cut the shoulders on the stretcher, I now need to reduce the width of the tenons. First of all, I want to cut 1/4 inch off the top of both tenons. Now we can directly mark off the length of the tenon from the mortise. And so we have this material to remove. But before I remove that, I want to mark out and cut for the mortise through here that the wedge is going to go through. So first of all, I want to mark the thickness of the side. That gives me a guide for putting the mortise in at the right angle and also in the right position, although I'll hold it a little bit closer to the shoulder so that if any drying out occurs of the side, the wedge can slip in and keep the joint nice and tight. On the top of the tenon, I've just eyeballed a centre line so that I can centre the mortise through there that's going to hold the wedge. You can chop the mortise entirely with a chisel, but since this is quite a narrow one and I've also got some knots in one end of the stretcher, I'm going to drill for it. I'm doing it with a pillar drill and I'm able to tilt the table to the correct angle. But you can always line up a hand drill and do the same. And I think you can see I'm drilling into what will be the waste at the bottom, so I won't get any blowout on the far side of the hole. Finished cutting the mortise by hand, and what we're looking for is a mortise that follows just behind the line we scribed, and which is slightly tapered, like so. That'll allow the wedge that we put in to fall down tighter and tighter if the joint becomes loose. And that's the stretcher fitted. Next time we'll make wedges to hold it in place and do a few final finishing touches. I've been asked by one of the viewers about how to avoid ragged edges. If you're working in something like this soft wood here, this is a piece of pine, and you can see the growth rings on the end there, quite widely spaced. And when you mark on it with a knife, you probably feel the knife juddering as it goes across. You can probably hear that as well. And the reason for that is part of the material is really soft and other parts of the ring are very hard. So it feels to the knife like a piece of corrugated iron really. It bumps up and down. Now with a sharp knife you end up with a nice sharp knife line. If you have a blunt knife then it can be a bit wobbly. The real problem occurs when you're sawing. You'll see that saw line is not as sharp as the knife line. The softer material tends to get squashed before it's cut and then it'll spring back and that ends up with a bit of a ragged edge. One way to try and cope with that is to knife your lines a little bit deeper. The sharp knife should cut really rather than squash, and then when you saw up to the knife line the surface of the cut should be nice and clean. I've demonstrated this before, that we use a chisel just to cut into the knife line. That sets the teeth of the saw slightly below the work surface before you start cutting. And you should see there that we've got the knife side here is nice and clean and the other side is a little bit ragged. Sawing into the end grain is a problem for the same reason. The soft areas want to compress and push out of the way rather than be cut. It's also quite difficult to knife in the end grain nice and cleanly because of the hard and soft areas. So my advice here is to mark your line either with a knife or a pencil and saw slightly away from the line and finish down to the line with a chisel. Pairing carefully with a sharp chisel, you should be able to leave a nice sharp edge on your line. Hardwood, like this oak, tends to be much more forgiving. When you knife a line, There's much less jumping of the knife. Get a very sharp line. But also, if you saw without marking, you still get a very nice clean cut.